Welcome to the UN Brief. Today we interview Dante Licona, who is responsible for social media at the International Federation of the Red Cross in Geneva.
See you. I haven't seen you in a while. And so today I would like to do this interview where we speak about, because I know you are in charge of the social media platforms and producing content and delivering. And of course, you have ways of measuring the impact. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So welcome to the UN Brief, Dante. It's a pleasure to have you here. We spoke about a year ago, I believe it was, maybe even more, right? I think it was during the start of the pandemic, where I was very intrigued about your work with social media platforms. You seem to have grasped quite well what works in order to reach the audiences that you have been looking for the International Red Cross. So tell us a little bit, in these last 2 years, how is it going?
And indeed, it has been quite a ride for the last 2 years and a half. The teams have been working nonstop, covering all sorts of possible emergencies on top of the global pandemic that we are all facing the consequences very much in our daily lives. In addition, and as you very well know, the IFRC is the largest humanitarian network in the world. Our members are essentially the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world. I am from Mexico. The Mexican Red Cross is our member. Here in Switzerland will be the Swiss Red Cross, and all over the world, you name it. We are there everywhere for everyone. And that means that our social media presence is also aiming to be there for everyone. We are trying to create compelling content that is valuable for the different audiences that we come across our different channels. So it's for us, it's also very important to have segmented audiences, different messaging for different platforms, for different audiences that we want to connect with at the different timings. So it has been quite a challenge, I have to say, but we also are very much encouraged by the efforts done by so many, more than 14 million volunteers from our network all over the world, doing their best for humanity and taking all sorts of emergency response activities, whether it's on climate action or, as we already mentioned, responding to public health crisis. So yeah, it has been quite a ride since the last time we spoke, and we keep learning. This is, as you know, a very dynamic space.
Indeed. I was curious, do you have an editorial calendar of sorts? Because you have reports that you put out regularly and you have fundraisers too. So I imagine that you have an editorial calendar, and then you also have, of course, the emergency surface, and then you have to deal with those as well. Tell us a little bit about how is it managing the editorial calendar? How big is your team?
Those are great questions to unpack because we are quite a dynamic team. For example, here in Geneva, we have the IFRC Secretariat. And in our IFRC cross-media team, that means the colleagues that work in social media and the web and design and video production, there are 8 of us. We have our manager, Nick, she's a team lead. I work for the social media, oversee the social media efforts, but we also have my colleague Melis, who is our chief campaigner, our colleague Leah, who is working across all the different aspects. And again, as I was saying, we have our colleagues working on web, on design and video. So 8 of us that are really at the global level. But we have colleagues all over the world, on our regional offices, in some delegations at the country level. But most importantly, we work really close with the communications colleagues from all the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So our communications colleagues from the British Red Cross and from the Bangladesh Red Crescent, we are in close contact.
So these are press relations officers as well that you are engaging with, because nowadays everything works in tandem, right? In terms of the messages they put out within the editorial calendar, and I imagine some coordination happens in some ways, I imagine.
And I would, rather than saying specific functions, I would say that the bar that brings us together is communication. So basically, in some countries, communications is understood as digital communications. In other countries, that distinction doesn't need to be made because everything is digital. So it really comes up to the different realities and contexts that we face in across all our network. That said, and going to your specific point, we do have regular calls, global calls, so we are all in the same page. So we identify the editorial priorities, whether that is about an ongoing emergency appeal that we need to support for example, a regional focus, but actually cross-regional emergency, for example, the hunger crisis right now that it's touching very much several parts of Africa, but also across the MENA region. And so there are a number of emergencies that we really need to be coordinated, so we know how to tell the stories that matter to the people so they can support their local Red Cross, their national Red Cross, the international bodies, so we can actually deliver the humanitarian assistance that is required at this moment. So those are how all these different pieces come together.
So it is really a global operation of sorts.
Absolutely.
Like you sort of managing in part from here, but of course in coordination with all this. So I imagine that this is an enormous amount of intelligence that you gather in terms of the response for these campaigns and so on and so forth. And how do you measure the impact? How do you use software? Do you have proprietary software in-house, or do you use services like, I think of Kantar or Cision? Do you use services like that that help you measure the impact of the communications campaigns?
Let me be very specific here. For example, when we talk about campaigns, we are talking about coordinated global campaigns. So for example, World Red Cross Red Crescent Day is a very internal campaign, but it's global. And it's really important for all campaigners around the world to define exactly what is the KPI. What do you want to achieve on every activation? Biggest KPIs is always to get the highest number possible of participation from all over the world. So we have 192 members. We would love to have all of them on board across our campaigns. So we try to bring them on board on consultations. We have then discussions. We try to make it as easy as possible for them to join. But that is one of the main KPIs that we find, right? So for example, our chief campaigner, Melis, she is really a force that brings everybody together. She's really the best campaigner you can think of in your team. And essentially, she helps us understand where are we going. She gives the direction. And once we understood what are the priorities of the organization, for example, campaigns on climate, then we can really move forward, come together, understand what are the best possible activations, in which countries, with collaboration with which influencers. Then we can measure the results. Then we can see how many people actually participated, how many people got engaged. One of the main KPIs is for the policymakers to see in the Red Cross and Red Crescent network as the trusted partner for climate action. So we can come up with policy recommendations for government, for example, in their disaster law frameworks, but also in international discussions such as COP that will be happening later this year in Egypt. We want the world to understand why the Red Cross and the Red Crescent must be at the table, because our volunteers are literally in the forefront, in the front lines of the climate action, because of the intensity of how climate change is really hitting harder with all the disasters happening with much more frequency and intensity. We need to be able not only to anticipate and prepare better, but also being able to push for example, what we call nature-based solutions, which are essentially the options that communities can adopt within their own environment for climate action. For example, more trees to give more shade and protect you from cyclones. So that's a concrete example of how this can work.
So how do you interrogate the data after the campaign is done, and how often do you do? Do you do it quarterly or fiscal quarter or monthly?
So we have several tools at our disposal. One of them is Talk Walker. Talk Walker is basically one platform that gives us a glimpse of how often we are mentioned across media, social media channels, across discussions, what is the share of voice, how we are present on the digital world, essentially. So that's one of our tools that we use in order for us to understand that, right? So for example, how the messaging is being received, how is this first wave of activation after the launch, how many outlets were talking about it, in how many languages, our spokespersons, did they have a specific impact in some specific
mentions, how many times they were mentioned,
exactly. So basically
the messages, how they surfaced, in where, in which context.
With this platform, I imagine
it's like amazing nowadays, because you have also all the social media outlets and people talking within the organization, outside of the organization, the journalists that are very active on social as well. So
exactly, and because of that,
a fascinating, intelligence gathering work after the campaigns are activated.
And the important thing here again is to know exactly what you're looking for, right? So, for example, we know that our experts are, I don't know, fluent in, let's say, Arabic. Then we know how to look for the names of our expert in Arabic, in an Arabic dashboard, or the same with our Spanish speakers colleagues. So that's how we can really dig in and see exactly the mentions, the impact, what is this. So it's really a global effort. And in this specific effort, my colleague Lea is the one who deserves all the credit, because she actually comes up with regular reports, sometimes at the bi-weekly, sometimes at monthly frequency. It really depends on the different activations that we come up with. So as you can imagine, for a global organization, it really takes a global village for really making these efforts being understood, and so we can also share them with our top management, so they can see the impact of the investment on communication, so they can support our work, so they can champion what we have to offer as a collective communications shop.
Thank you for watching and listening to the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe